Right. Anna, can we get started? Anna, are we live?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. So welcome to Brazil Seminar. It's a great pleasure for us to be back in the classroom. And at the same time, we're taking advantage of technology and making this session, at least part of it, available online as well. And today we're going to be discussing a very hot topic, not only relevant for Brazil, but also for anyone who cares about dissemination of the information. So let me introduce our distinguished speaker today. It's a pleasure to have here with us Patricia Campos Melo. She's a visiting scholar here at Columbia, spending some time at the J School. And she's a reporter at large and columnist at Folha de São Paulo newspaper, one of Brazil's largest media outlets. For over 25 years, she has been covering international relations, economics, and human rights, and has reported from over 50 countries. She has been awarded the Columbia University Maria Moore Scholar Award in 2020, the International Press Freedom Award of the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, in 2019, the Vladimir Herzog Special Award for Democracy and Justice in 2019. And there are so many other prizes that I'm going to stop here. But since 2014, she has been publishing a series of stories about illegal use of WhatsApp mass messaging to send fake news and other influence operations to manipulate public opinion, one of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. In October 2019, WhatsApp admitted to the irregular use of the platform in the 2018 Brazilian elections. The stories led the judiciary system to change the electoral regulations and ban, in 2019, mass messaging by WhatsApp. She's the author of the book A Máquina do Ódio, Notas de uma Repórter sobre Fake News e Violência Digital, about disinformation campaigns by populist leaders in Brazil, India, and US, intimidation of journalists led by the Bolsonaro administration, and the erosion of freedom of the press in Brazil. So, Patricia, great pleasure to have you in the classroom as a speaker.
Thank you, Sidney. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thank you for having me. I think I'm going to start talking about, I thought about talking about the problem in Brazil and in general, and then about the research I'm doing here at Columbia. It might be interesting, and you guys, you tell me, and then we open for questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure you guys have been reading or have heard a lot about all these books describing how democracy doesn't die the old way it used to, right? I mean, you have the erosion of institutional checks and balances. I mean, you don't have the classic coup d'etat. You have democracies that are, you have elected autocrats, so to say, and checks and balances are being gradually eroded. So there's like tons of books about this and really good books. And one of the things that maybe we're not talking about enough is the new kind of censorship. The same way you don't need to have, a classic military coup d'etat or a soldiers closing down Congress and the Supreme Court. You don't need to have the classic censorship we used to have, for instance, in Brazil during military dictatorship, that you had literally a censor inside the newspapers telling, you can publish this, you can publish that. Usually now it's much easier to use censorship by noise. And I'm going to talk about Ukraine and Russia in a bit, but not yet, because it's also an interesting development of the whole censorship by noise, let's say, phenomenon. So instead of trying to silence opposition, dissidents, journalists, media outlets, you just flood all the possible channels with the information you want to, with the versions you want to prevail, or even, not even the versions you want to prevail, but you just want to make people unsure about what's true and what's not. It's not actually that you want people to believe X, Y, Z, but if you make people really confused about what's going on and not knowing what's true and what's not and not caring about it that much, that usually benefits a specific type of leader. And that's not the moderate leader. That's the extremist leader. It's a populist leader. It could be in the left, in the right, doesn't matter, but it's not the moderate guy. And social media is really the perfect medium for that. Because as you all have been reading a lot and better than I am sure, the algorithms really amplify extremist speech. Anything that appeals to strong emotions gets promoted by the algorithms, even though internet platforms have been tweaking the algorithms here and there, and there's regulation. It's still really hard to make the truth go viral. And it's not only a matter of algorithms. For instance, with messaging apps, we have Telegram, we have WhatsApp. There's no algorithm there. But still, this most like outraging content, and of course, the one that endorses your pre-existing beliefs is the one that disseminates much faster. There's tons of studies about this. There's one that's the classic one at MIT, showing how much faster fake news travels compared to accurate information on Twitter. Having this in mind, one of the only things or the last things that is really, I'm gonna go back. The dream of any leader is not to have a middleman when he's communicating with the supporters, right? You don't want to have anyone saying, oh, that's not really accurate. No, I have a different view, or that the figure you're mentioning, it's not like that. So, of course, any leader, they really don't like journalists. That's period. It's always been like that. So they're always trying to eliminate the filter or the gatekeeper, right? So in that sense, social media is the ideal way to do that, because you're just communicating with your supporters directly with no filter. This is not, it's not exclusive to, let's say, Donald Trump or Bolsonaro or Duterte. It's always been like this. I mean, even, let's say, Barack Obama, he was the one who started using a lot of social media, for instance, to communicate, doing live videos to communicate with his supporters and not doing so many press briefings. So it's always been like that. But as the social media and the use of personal data was getting more widespread, they were getting more efficient in trying to bypass the media and try to avoid the filter, right? For that to work, you have to eliminate the messenger, sort of. So instead of just trying to silence, literally, you either intimidate or you delegitimize journalists and media outlets. When you guys live here in the US, and again, you know that much better than I do, is by delegitimizing, let's say, a group of media outlets, you basically keep people in two different information ecosystems. If you're the one watching Fox News, you think that every single thing that goes on MSNBC or that you read in the New York Times is fake news, and the other way around, right? I mean, each one in its, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but anyway, the healthy thing should be to watch both. But anyway, so in Brazil and in other countries, it's the same thing. So I'm going to tell how I started studying this. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for many years. And I used to cover migration, refugees. I was a foreign correspondent. I used to cover conflict, Libya, Iraq, nothing to do with politics or disinformation. But I covered a lot of elections in other countries, including in the US. I covered the 2008, 2012 Obama elections, 2016 Trump election, and in India. And these were pivotal elections in terms of the use people were making of personal data in elections. In the Obama years, there was this very optimistic view at that time. And I remember because I got to travel with Obama volunteers around the country for get out the vote operations, which was really interesting. And the way they were using for the first time information of the volunteers to organize the volunteers for the get out the vote efforts, and also to get small donors, that would democratize the whole fundraising thing. You wouldn't be so dependent on big donors. So there was this very optimistic and maybe naive view of what you could do with people's data in terms of election campaigns and communicating more effectively with your supporters. In 2014, the general elections in India that led to the victory of the BJP and the Prime Minister, and Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister, was also an election that we started paying attention to a more intensive use of personal data. Modi was, at that time, he was one of the leading leaders using Twitter to communicate, and also WhatsApp groups. They were organizing like thousands and thousands of WhatsApp groups and already using people's data to micro-target messaging. India had, and I think pretty much still has, a very lax privacy law. So for instance, you could buy people's utility bills. And with that, you sort of segment people by income level. You can access voter rolls in India. So by the last name, you can sort of have a notion about the caste, about the religion. So with all those information, they were segmenting messages. And they had thousands of WhatsApp groups. And this is very effective in mobilizing people and also in keeping people in your information bubble, right? So that election was very interesting. I did stories about this. And then 2016, of course, was the year that everybody realized that, that might not be so good. Internet elections, that's a bit creepy what's happening, and then Brexit. So I'm not going to talk about 2016, you all know what happened. So then in 2018, I'll go back. 2018. In 2018, I was in Brazil. And one of the things that was happening, we were all seeing, is that the use of the amount of this information circulating through WhatsApp groups was just humongous. I mean, it's just overwhelming. And I started investigating the automation in that. Like what everybody was saying at that time, it's not all organic. There was some automation. Although it's always important to say, there's this view that, it's all because of bots, and no, it's mainly real people doing stuff, right? But you do have it. What makes network propaganda so powerful is that it's a mix. You might have some strategy coming from a center, and then you have some automation. You might have trolls, you might have the troll farms and bots. But then you have real people who believe in that, amplifying your message organically. So in Brazil, I started looking into agencies, middlemen, that basically were selling automation processes, WhatsApp, software emulators, to reach thousands and thousands of groups at the same time, very fast, and to spread a message that was the right message at that point. We can talk about this later, but the political situation was against incumbent. There was a particular situation. So I did this story about WhatsApp. Then in 2019 in India, and I mean, in Brazil, and we can keep talking about this, but I mean, they use, and they still, I did stories in the last municipal elections, 2020, they're still doing this. It's just one of the things you use. It's not like, oh, WhatsApp. Oh, no, it's a whole, range of things you use. So for instance, one of the things they use, and you can do this, you can all try it. You can download, you can buy online software. It's very cheap, that you scrape from, let's say, I am running for mayor. No, I am running for vereador. How do you say that?
Okay.
Councilman?
Yeah, councilman.
Okay. councilman in a specific neighborhood in São Paulo. So I want to target people who like the mall next in this neighborhood. So I get this software really cheap, and it scraped everybody that posted something on Instagram with the hashtag XYZ mall. So then I have a list of phone numbers, and I can target these people specifically, saying, oh, I'm running for councilman, and I'm gonna increase or decrease tax for this mall or whatever, and or negative campaigning against your opponent. Same thing with Facebook. You can scrape people who are in groups. So I want to, send a specific message for people who are in the group. We favor less regulation for weapons in Brazil. So you target. So this is being done. And in India, again, those things also, evolved. People were using more. And then you had apps, candidate apps. For instance, one of the things that they did was very interesting was in one of the social programs, they were trying to make internet cheaper, more available to people. So like an income direct cash transfer program was like a subsidized smartphone pre-installed with apps and with access to the internet for low-income people. And those smartphones, like millions of smartphones, came with specific apps pre-installed, like Namo app, as in Narendra Modi, and the chief minister apps, depending on the state. Chief minister is like the governor. So in those apps, you're like gathering data from the people. Whenever we just check those boxes, you give permission to, we're just giving permission to anything. And they just get your data, including geolocalization data. And they are feeding you news with, the bias you want people to have. So this was also very smart. And the other thing that I forgot, they also use, in terms of getting data from people to micro-target better, social programs. You get lists, like it's precious in terms of getting voters information, because you get lots of information. If you have, let's say, a specific state doing subsidized gas or subsidized food or cash transfer, you get this data. If you don't have proper privacy laws and watchdogs. So this is being done in many places, India, in Brazil, in many places. So now we got to, some things changed. In the beginning, I'm going to say from our perspective, in Brazil in 2018, there was this perception that everything was organic. And then people became aware that there's a lot of manipulation going on, and trying to use our data to target us with specific information. And there's been pressure for regulation, just like here in the US, in Brazil as well. But at the same time, the technology evolves. So people are saying, oh, so WhatsApp. If it's not WhatsApp, it's something else. Like, for instance, now we have in Brazil, and then I can speak a little bit about the project here. And then if you have some specific, I'm speaking too fast, I guess. Anyway, so here, I'm doing this project it's like a preparedness project for 2022 presidential elections in Brazil. As you might have heard, we also have our own Stop the Steal thing going on. The president of Brazil, he has been saying for several months that the voting machines are vulnerable and that past elections were fraudulent. So there's a big chance that elections are going to be rigged. So it's very similar to what happened here in the US, where you had former President Trump saying that, mail voting was going to be rigged, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the whole Stop the Steal movement still going on. So lots of people are trying to at least monitor electoral disinformation in Brazil, so that we can try to avoid, or to be prepared to avoid some January 6th kind of thing happening in Brazil. So in this project here, I'm working with different universities, University of Minas Gerais and University of Rio de Janeiro. One of one part of the project is a WhatsApp Telegram monitor. Okay, what happened is WhatsApp, after a wave of lynchings in India in 2018, and after the WhatsApp thing in Brazil, they implemented several changes in the way the messaging app works. It's like friction mechanisms that make it harder for you to disseminate or to forward messages that are going viral. So, I mean, they did realize it was a problem, they admit, and they basically realized there was a huge PR problem because the whole thing was very negative to them. So they actually improved the product. They are cooperating with electoral authorities, and they are suing the agencies that sell, automation and all these things that are not that go against their terms of services. At the same time, you had this movement, as you had here, when the internet platform started to moderate political speech, or at least moderate content that could be viewed as glorifying violence, there was a migration to other internet apps like Parler, Gab, Getter, and Telegram in Brazil. There's a lot of migration to Telegram. Some leaders promoting Telegram, saying, this is really because it's a different structure. It is also a messaging app, but it's not really a messaging app because you have channels that have up to 200,000 people in each channel. Sorry, groups up to 200,000 people in each group, and channels with unlimited number of people. Sorry.
A little bit like Discord.
Discord as well. Sorry, my son is.
But the fake news distribution is very little in Discord.
Okay. Pick up.
Thank you.
So, Telegram. So Telegram became a really big concern in Brazil because we have a huge group. We have, to give you an example, you can be a member of groups talking about early treatment, COVID early treatment, which is basically vaccine, anti-vaxxers and people who believe in hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Or you can get into groups with thousands of people saying, elections are going to be fraudulent, we can't accept the results. So this is one concern. So we have these two monitors, WhatsApp and Telegram, started to have an idea of what kind of disinformation is circulating. So at least there can be some counter narrative from mainstream media outlets so that we don't amplify fake narratives. And of course, electoral authorities are also monitoring this. I mean, the only way you can fight against disinformation, if from a perspective not of regulation or of changing the product, but from a perspective of, let's say, civil society or journalists, is with accurate information. There's not much else you can do. So, and yes, it is a challenge to make accurate information go viral the same way that disinformation does. But still, the idea is to detect early when you have certain narratives spreading, and try to do the counter narrative work, as in spreading accurate information. We might debate later if people actually want to have accurate information, or some people will be confronted with accurate information and they still want to believe what they believe. But I mean, this is the only thing we can do, right? Confront people. This is accurate, this is factual, this is not. And then after that, it's freedom of expression, it's freedom of thought. You believe what you want. So these two monitors. The other thing is, another problem is the junk news websites. Junk news websites, they look like legitimate news websites. They even emulate, the layout, the design, but they're actually either hyper-partisan websites that are spreading news with a very specific bias without saying they are either supported or promoted or financed by people belonging to a specific party, or they're just disinformation. They're just looking for clicks. And the difficult thing is not always they have someone financing the whole thing, like this evil person behind it. You can just be monetizing with Google Ads. It's like the Macedonian guys. They were, they had websites for Hillary and for Trump. They didn't care. Whoever clicks, it's ad money. So we also have that. So what do you do with that? You have to argue with Google. Google is enabling this in a way. So this is the other thing. And the other thing is political ads on Facebook and on Google. One of the other thing we did is we did a report showing all the changes, the policy changes the internet platforms made here in the US in 2020 because of the elections, right? They did enact several policy changes in terms of, changing moderation policies, changing access to groups that they call civic groups. I mean, there's a whole list. And even with all those policy changes, it was still very bad, and we saw what happened. So in Brazil, as in other countries that are not viewed as so central as the US or Europe, there's even less moderation. There's less investment in moderation, and there's less concern about what's happening, right? Because it's not so perceived as so important. So we compared all the moderation policy, all the policies, election policies that the platforms were implemented or promised to implement in Brazil for this year's election to what was done in the US. And of course, the comparison is ridiculous. Like one of the things that Google promised to do because of the elections was a special doodle. You know what's doodle? What's that thing? For election 2022. And we're saying it's not really essential at this point, right? We're trying not to have a January 6th kind of thing. So anyway, so this is the other thing we did so that we have information to put pressure on the internet platforms for them to enact policies. And one of the things that they don't have is, because the other thing we're doing is monitoring political ads. It's very difficult. Facebook has something that is very transparent, that is the ad library. In the ad library, if it's a political ad, you can see, who paid for it, what's the targeted audience, blah, blah. So it's very important also because you need to have accountability for campaign spending. This all has to be reported to electoral authorities. If you don't have this transparency, you don't know who's paying for what. So this is something we are monitoring because one of the things is AI is not so effective as they make us believe, right? And including in other languages that are not English. It's not so well developed. You don't have enough human moderators. At some point, you need a human in there. It's not enough just to have AI. So we're monitoring that. And Google, for instance, Google does have a transparency report in several countries. And I don't have the list here, but like US, Australia, but not in Brazil. So in Brazil, you have all these political ads and you don't know who's paying for it. There's no transparency. So this is the other thing we're monitoring. So by doing all that, the hope is that we are better prepared after what happened in 2018 in Brazil, in 2020 in the US, that at least there's going to be some transparency and some accountability in terms of attempts to manipulate public opinion, be it through those fake junk news websites, which are very effective because the way it works is that you have an ecosystem of information. It's being shared on the Telegram channels, WhatsApp channels, WhatsApp groups. So you also keep people in this very particular information bubble, right? So we need to understand what's going on in that. And also the more mainstream or the big internet platforms, how effective are the tools they have developed to sort of avoid social media to be weaponized against democracy, basically. I'm not sure if you have questions or if I talk more. Speak too fast.
No, I know that there's a lot of those
Okay,
questions
sorry.
to ask you, but is there something that you would like to tell us to conclude those thoughts before we go
To conclude, yeah, well,
Yeah.
to conclude this is, I guess at this point, we're all trying to understand what kind of regulation is going to be helpful in terms of not repeating the democratic process failures that were facilitated by internet platforms in a way, unwillingly, but were. What kind of what works and what doesn't against disinformation, counter narrative, how do you make, fact checking or accurate journalism go viral? What kind of changes journalism has to go through to recover some of the credibility as well, and sort of to fight all those attempts to delegitimize professional media. So I guess at this point we have more questions than answers, but at least we are all more aware of what's happening around us, and we are putting pressure on electoral authorities, on internet platforms, on traditional media to change and to act, because what can't happen is that, again, we're going to sit and watch, slow motion coup d'etat develop. So at least fight for transparency, it's the least we could do.
Thanks so much, Patricia.
Thank you.
Excellent. So before we go into the Q&A part, there are some questions that I would like to ask you, and feel free to just react to them. But the first one is, to what extent there are parallels that we can draw between what we saw in the US during the Trump's election and Bolsonaro's election in terms of the tools that are being used, the way that fake news worked and didn't work in both contexts?
Excellent question. It's interesting. Brad Parscale, who was first a digital manager for Trump's campaign, and then he became like the campaign manager, he said in the beginning of 2020, so before the pandemic started, that their plan was to send, not the number, like 1 billion text messages to Trump supporters. They would gather the phone numbers in rallies, and this would be the communication. And it was so, and I was reading this, like, this is WhatsApp in Brazil, right? Except there was a pandemic, there were no rallies, and the rallies they had were like really not, no one showed up. So that didn't go anywhere. But what did happen, and what is important and interesting in terms of comparing Brazil to the US, we both have attempts to delegitimize the electoral process itself, right? Coming from leaders, from presidents. What is a challenge is, together with fake information, as in it's been common. Every election you have the classic fake news about elections, which is a picture of somewhere and there's a list of voters and saying, oh, see, there's like 200 people who voted for XYZ and there's only 100 people registered to vote here. This is the classic. And it's usually, that was in Japan or some other place. But what if you're using true information? I mean, information that is not necessarily false, and you're not using bots to mobilize people. You have people, like actual people mobilizing to confront electoral processes. A big question that happened here in the US and is happening in Brazil is internet platforms, and all of us, we have been pretty much, we understood that inauthentic coordinated behavior, which is the name that Facebook gives to that, is something we have to fight. This is what bots or people impersonating, or you hiring troll farms. But what if you have coordinated authentic behavior? If you have real people organizing a protest to overturn an election that was not fraudulent. So this is something we need to learn what to do with this. Like you have issues of freedom of speech or not, then you have issues of So I think this is something that it was a big question here in the US, and it's going to be a big issue in Brazil as well.
Pretty good. And this topic is so hot and so new that we're seeing a throw of themes that were not present in any of those discussions even a couple of years ago. Right? For example, the importance of influencers. Because you mentioned that there are some certain limitations to the role that AI can play. Right? What have we learned about how influencers, deliberately or not, the way that they can act to move the needle in how electoral processes and politics is perceived among the general population?
That's super interesting. There was some research, I did a story on that like a month ago, that shows that young voters in Brazil, the main source of political information for them is influencers, but they're not political influencers. They're just regular influencers, like Big Brother people who in their Instagram accounts or where they speak about politics. But it's not the main thing, but they are speaking about politics. But if, I don't know, the winner of Big Brother happens to say, you know, I think this policy supported by this candidate this really is absorbed by young voters. So it's something that we have to think, I mean, how do you get political information to young voters? How do they get there, you know? And in terms of campaign spending legislation, how can you separate an influencer like I support the candidate, so I want to speak to my 100 million followers that I support him, and I mean, is he being paid, or is he getting something in exchange, or how do you account for this? Is that campaign spending? Is that, so this is something that things that people are really looking into to see how to regulate this.
Very good. And when you talk about best practices in dealing with fake news, can we think about examples around the world that Brazil and other countries could adopt?
Well, Europe is the more, the European Union has several legislation. Some of them are being discussed and some of them are already in place. And specifically Germany, they have a more, let's say, intrusive kind of legislation. But they're actually, the main concern is hate speech. In the same way that Germany is much less liberal in regards to freedom of speech compared to the US. I mean, you all know, here you can, you know, whatever, have the swastika in your house because that's your freedom of speech. And in Germany, you can't. In terms of moderating content in the social media, Germany is also a bit more intrusive and demands a bit more transparency. So Germany is interesting. There is a bill being discussed here, there in Brazil. It's probably going to be voted by the end of the month. It does absorb some of the parts of Germany, which is parts self-regulation and parts that you need to have an agency monitoring if the self-regulation is being implemented, followed. And then, of course, here in the US, there's a big discussion about antitrust legislation, which doesn't get to us because we're just periphery, right? But what does get to us is algorithm transparency legislation, which is pretty interesting, you know, to understand how, what kind of data is feeding the algorithm and which kind of biases do the algorithms have. And, you know, transparency, and also transparency as to how the platforms are moderating content, and how can you appeal to this power that they have, this excessive power to say, you know, this is allowed, this is not. Because the thing is, it's interesting when we had the image of the marketplace of ideas, right? And I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, the justice, that said that a free trade in ideas is the best way because the stronger ideas will naturally win. So what do you do when you don't have like an actual marketplace of ideas? It's a private marketplace that you can, some people are using loudspeaker, and some other people, they can pay and use like I don't know, like a microphone inside people's heads, because you can improve the reach of your message, right? So it's very different when you have private entities that are actually saying what is allowed and what is not in the marketplace of ideas. So, yeah.
Maybe this is not part of your scope of expertise, but I'd love to get your reaction on countries that are perceived as less democratic. To what extent that also has an impact in dissemination of fake news? Is there some kind of self-censoring mechanism that has the side benefit of limiting the dissemination of misinformation?
Well, one thing that some less democratic countries like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, they have, or they had at one point, legislation that was basically to curb disinformation, but ended up criminalizing regular people who were, accidentally sharing false information. So that's a risk when you try to over-legislate, when you try to code into legislation what is disinformation and what is not. Like, who's the person who says that? Is it like the truth ministry? Is it the president? Is it a random judge? Or is it the platform? So there is a risk, and we've seen this happening in those countries, that you end up criminalizing the wrong people, not the professional influence operations, or the political operations, but just the regular people who happen to share something that is not true. And on the other hand, non-democratic countries, I think Russia is an interesting example. Russia is, the Crimea annexation in 2014 was like this case study for disinformation. It's just the way they try to dissociate themselves from the actions in Ukraine, in Crimea, by using proxies and by using a disinformation campaign that basically was its goal was to get people really confused about what was happening and who was invading what and who was responsible. Was very it was like it was a case study, became a case study of how to use an influence operation. If you compare to now, you see that they're resorting to the old school censorship, because the propaganda or the disinformation is not working that well, right? They're not. They tried. There was this movement among basically the Biden administration and I think Boris Johnson as well, that they called the pre-bunking. So they were sharing very early all intelligence gathered in order to prevent them from, spreading false flags or manufacturing or how do you say this, like having videos, false videos that would be used as an excuse for an invasion, for instance. So there was this movement of pre-bunking, and there's also a lot of, which is very interesting, a lot of open source intelligence, like people, just voluntary, regular people that are studying, satellite images or pictures and saying, this is not true, that is going on, because you can see this is public information. So because of a lot of reasons at this point, and also because it's really hard to, disguise people dying in a very, massive way, propaganda is not working that well. So they are just blocking and resorting to the old kind of censorship. So I guess, which is the China way, in a way, right? The Chinese also are very, at least abroad, they have very specific influence operations. People want comments and on Twitter, troll farms, but inside, censorship is still the main tool to control communication.
Perfect. And Brazil passed a few years ago one of the most progressive legislation on regulating the internet, right? The Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights. And I think one of the main topics of that particular bill was the accountability of platforms, right? The world has changed since then. To what extent do you see that particular framework being adapted to the situation we are seeing right now, and what extent do we need to update our laws in order to deal with fake news?
It's a very interesting discussion. The Marco Civil da Internet was inspired in a way, I mean, in the Section 230 of the Decency Communications Act. That is, the Section 230, the famous Section 230, which is also being discussed here in terms of it was essential for internet, for social media companies to exist and to thrive, because it exempts from liabilities from the companies are not liable for content posted by third parties, right? Otherwise, you would not have anything, because Facebook would not allow anything posted in Facebook because I could be sued by someone else, right? So it was very important. That was in '96 in the US, and Marco Civil, I forgot the exact 2014, right? 2014 in Brazil. So it was essential at one point to develop. But now you have a few big and very powerful companies that are still not liable. So you sort of create the wrong incentives in terms of being accountable or having incentives to curb disinformation, because they can't be held accountable. They're not responsible for that, right? So there's a discussion, and I think it is important. I don't think it's going to be the solution to everything. Some people say, if you just change Section 230, it's going to solve a problem. No, but it is something that has to be discussed and is being discussed. There are some issues that, depending on how you do this, you might end up empowering even more the big platforms and having less competition among startups. So there are other unintended consequences of changes in this piece of legislation, but I think it's necessary to discuss.
By the way, and we can leave this for the private part of the discussion, but we know that you've attended meetings in some of those large social media conglomerates where they discuss these issues, right? So, your perception that how platforms are adapting to the change in society, are they reactive, or they are trying to anticipate how things are moving in order to, of course, trying to address the problem, but also to protect their own businesses?
I would say that Facebook papers was a very interesting insight into the working. I mean, I also did stories with the Facebook papers, and of course, well, first, I think it's all basically a PR problem. The moment it became a very big PR problem, they started acting on that. But I still think that they understand they need to change the product to avoid this, bad effects on democracy. However, depending on the kind of changes you make to the product, you're going to make it much less profitable. And that's not resolved yet. This is still something that they are discussing. So,
pretty good. So I think that's a segue for the second part of the discussion, that we have some issues that we'd like to address in a more private setting. But I'd like to thank our viewers for joining us online, and we are stopping the broadcasting right now.